висотна Band University, kriterije do kuratori Ankit, kriterije do kuratora arhitekturas, kuratori paviljoner pazi bienale med veliko prioriteter прочекала дружба Levy. Теж CV на тем посом по различию к нему книжным презентациям, что интересно. Якщо любите не аплодис.
Can everybody hear me? Yeah. It's such a pleasure and an honor to be here in Pristina. Thank you for the invitation and for the warmth. I've been in the region for a while. I was in Sarajevo and in Bosnia for a bit, and then in Serbia, and it feels so much more open here, vibrant, and so it's really so exciting to be here. I have a number of thoughts to offer in the next hour or so, some historical and some contemporary, all concern the challenge that I think we face in architecture today, and also the possibilities that we face as young curators, architects, artists, and others. I'm going to be talking to you both about the work that I do in Philadelphia, the city that I come from, about 2 hours or so south of New York City. But also, again, about the field and my concerns as a curator and educator in the field of architecture. Last night, those of you that were here for last night's presentations heard Asa from Rana Rod Architects speak about a private conception of architecture. I don't know if you remember this image. It was towards the end of his presentation, but he spoke about a free port, and kind of a non-legal, extra-legal space in Singapore that they designed, that they built, for basically storing private wealth, private art collections, wealth that should be hidden from the state. And I want to offer a different model tonight. I want to offer a model of architecture that's not on the side of privacy and private wealth, but on the side of public space, public architecture, civic imagination. So again, I want to kind of, in a way, push against last night's model and maybe create a little tension and get things excited. In a certain sense, this conversation, that tension between maybe a more formal definition of architecture and a more social definition of architecture, it has a long history. In 1932, in the United States, there was a key exhibition, a really essential exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art. And it really focused on international style, kind of an emergent modernism. And in that architecture, we had a similar tension. On the one hand, architecture presented by the curators as, let's say, an abstract form in the landscape. On the other hand, architecture understood as a social relationship, in relationship to social need. Kind of architecture in a functional sense, right? So that kind of polarity, that binary, that tension between architecture as a formal practice, as a kind of an abstract kind of a shape in the landscape, and architecture as a social relationship with those in need, with society more generally, that is kind of where I want to situate us tonight. In a certain sense, that exhibition kind of laid the groundwork, I think, for a whole shift in the United States, or at least an engagement in the United States, with a more corporate definition of architecture. Some of you may know this SOM building, the Skidmore Merrill building, the Union Carbide building from the kind of the 60s. You can see how the kind of use of interior space is so pronounced. It's not the public space that we're focused on, but rather the internalization of public space inside corporate structures. Or you can see that in offices as well. So what I want to do is kind of propose, again, kind of a different model. And I'm going to take you back to the show, the exhibition that I organized in Venice for the 2008 Venice Biennale for Architecture. And then I'm going to kind of move to the present. So in 2008, towards the end of the Bush administration, we really felt like there was a need, my colleagues and I felt there was a really strong and urgent need to change, or to at least propose a change in how the architectural community was thinking about its responsibilities. Our concern was that the public sector was basically privatizing further and further. And we, again, were really interested in thinking, what is the role of an architect? What is the role of a citizen in an era of privatization? Which is, I know, something that's familiar to all of you because it's the same conversation that's happening here. And also, how do we represent the nation? How do we represent the nation with pride and with respect, but also represent communities that have been excluded for many years, or that have faced challenges in receiving support. And so these were all the questions that we were struggling with. We were interested in communities like this. This is a city, a small town actually, Greensboro, that was erased by a hurricane, basically the equivalent of like a tornado. And we were interested in what role does an architect play in this kind of a community that's been erased, where civic infrastructure has been erased. Or what role can an architect play in relation to migrant farm workers and undocumented individuals that don't necessarily have the protection that citizenship often affords, don't have clean water, that don't have good medical care? How can an architect in the United States take responsibility for those kind of marginalized, invisible communities? Or communities, for instance, in rural Alabama that face kind of extraordinary difficulty with basic kind of infrastructure, access to, again, to good water supply or to electricity, that often live in trailers, and those that are very poor in society. We're, again, concerned about what role the architectural community will take on and play in that space. Or what role can architects play in relation to incarceration, to kind of mass incarceration in America? And so we were interested in architects that are often working on their own or in small organizations, but are totally transforming kind of the horizon and the future in the United States. And we wanted to champion their work. So for instance, I showed you the work of an architect, Laura Kirkin from Columbia University in New York. She has been mapping all of the money that's spent on incarceration, on prisons in the United States. And then she works with community members, with local architects, activists, and others to demand change from political representatives. So we're interested in this model, kind of a single architect or a small group of architects who diagnose a problem in society, and then they work without a lot of support, but they work to change that problem, that condition in society. And so that was, in a way, the basis of our exhibition. So we transformed the U.S. Pavilion, which some of you may know, a Jeffersonian kind of building, fairly neoclassical, into kind of a very different space, a space for conversation and debate and discussion. And we focused on these 16 projects, 16 architects in different parts of the United States. Inside the exhibition, you can see it was kind of really an open space, not so much a space of presentation as a space of provocation. And then on the front of the pavilion, we basically kind of displayed the research of one architect that I'll talk quite a bit about tonight, Teddy Cruz, who lives in San Diego, which is a city just a few miles north of the border with Mexico. So he lives just a few miles above the most trafficked checkpoint in the world. And his research of all the conflicts that define the landscape in California and in Mexico, all of the kind of issues that architects can tackle and take responsibility for, that was displayed on the front of the pavilion. So in a way, you had to pass through the border with the United States to enter into the exhibition. I'm not going to talk more about that exhibition because I really want to talk to you about some of the work I've been doing since then and some of the conversations I've been having with other architects and community organizers since then. But maybe this would be a good encapsulation, a good kind of succinct statement about what we were trying to argue for in that exhibition. It is the work of Laura Kirkin, again, that architect from Columbia University that I mentioned. And she writes, a city is not simply a collection of people or buildings, but rather a network of relationships. So I know in this week's kind of presentations and in maybe your studies, for those of you that are students, you've probably been presented with architecture as a physical structure. You know, architecture defined as a physical kind of infrastructure, let's say. I want to propose a totally different definition of architecture tonight, which is architecture as a social relationship, architecture understood socially. And so I want to really try to shift the discourse in a different direction. So first, though, I want to take you back a bit. There's a long history, actually, for thinking about architecture as a social relationship. We're often not taught it, but there are many histories. I wanted to show you kind of a brief window into one history, which is also kind of one that I found in Venice, in Italy, as I was working in Venice, as I was working on that Biennale. The Biennale, as you know, has a long history. It dates from 1895. In the 60s, in 68 in particular, a great deal of socio-political tumult emerges around the world, much like we've all experienced in the last few months and years. But particularly in Venice, students and artists, many of whom were exhibiting, didn't feel comfortable with the structure of the institution that they were exhibiting within. They didn't feel comfortable with how their society was negotiating these challenges. And so they quite literally closed the exhibition. And they protested the institution of the Biennale. I'm interested in the response that the Biennale took to that protest, to that moment. In the years following '68, a new chapter of the Biennale would emerge. Rather than just being an exhibition of art, it now also opened another kind of strand of exhibition, another trajectory, which was to focus on architecture. And not any form of architecture, but particularly architectural practices that responded to the lived conditions and challenges that Venice faced, that Italy faced, and the global architectural community faced. So the first architecture exhibition in Venice in 1975 by Vittorio Brigotti, I don't know if you've studied his work, an Italian architect. It wasn't about architecture as a physical structure, it was about architecture again as a social relationship. He asked architects and artists from around the world to respond to Venice and its challenges, and to help kind of Venetians think about a new future for Venice. In particular, the exhibition was focused on one site in the city called the Molino Stucchi. At that time, basically for 20 years it had been abandoned. It was a mill, a granary mill. And for 20 years it had been kind of derelict, abandoned, not developed. And it was emblematic, it was kind of like a metaphor for the city of Venice. And so Brigotti asked architects and artists to imagine a new future, but not just individually, in relationship to the city and in collaboration and conversation with residents in the city. And you can see some of these projects that they developed in these images. There are other histories, the Italian collective Super Studio, for instance, the architectural group. They were interested in ephemeral architecture. They developed structures made out of salt. The water from the canal in Venice would melt these structures. So they were interested in a temporary architecture, and architecture again understood in relation to the site. You probably know Aldo Rossi's Teatro del Mundo, this theater of the world, this floating kind of theater that was also a temporary structure that he had built for the Biennale. And then there are other examples from the other arts, from other art fields and sectors. The Living Theater, for instance, decided to not have their performances in a theater internally, kind of understood, but rather for the city to be understood as a theater. And then this is my favorite, it's the Belgian collective Pink. They don't exist anymore. They kind of established in San Marco, in the main square, a huge cocoon. And in that cocoon were thousands upon thousands of butterflies that were kind of opened and unleashed through a collective kind of activity. So again, these are social gestures, these are social acts, and they're very ephemeral. They don't live forever, but they enable a sense of community, and they enable a transformation of a society in transition. And so again, I want to offer these as the model that we should really be building upon, rather than maybe an earlier kind of model, such as in that 1932 exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art. And one last image from Venice. This is in 1980. The Arsenale looked like that image on the left. I don't know if any of you have had a chance to go to Venice, if many of you have had the opportunity, but it was kind of in a certain sense like a military kind of, storage space, somewhat abandoned, used to store various pieces of military or arsenal. And Paolo Portoghese, another important Italian architect, who interestingly, maybe with relationship to Christina, built a really important mosque in Rome that you should try to see if you ever have the opportunity. He proposed another model for exhibitions and for the Biennale itself. He proposed that in a certain sense that Arsenale be recovered, restored, and given back to the city as a site of exhibition. And so again, I want to think about an exhibition not just as an opportunity to promote one's work, or an opportunity to kind of promote a particular idea, but as an opportunity to give something back to a city and to leave traces. So not just about, an exhibition is not just about what we do in the time and space of the exhibition, but what we can leave behind through that act of exhibiting. So I want to come now back to Philadelphia, the city that I come from and that on Friday I returned to. As a curator, as an educator, I feel incredibly responsible for my city. I could live in another city. I have the opportunity to move somewhere else, but it's Philadelphia that I call home and that I feel I want to be a part of the transformation of in the years ahead. It's a city that has great challenges. In a certain sense, it might be one of the few cities in the United States that you could kind of relate to the Balkans. It's a very divided city, a city marked by great tensions, and a city that's not unlike many of the cities that in my last 2 weeks here in the region I've passed through and worked in. Much of the city looks like this, kind of abandoned, derelict, facing all sorts of challenges. People still live in these structures, but there's a lack often of investment in public infrastructure. The social fabric has been kind of torn. And so the question of what role we can play is one that, again, I'm always going back to. I want to propose kind of a historical image as a way to understand this contemporary moment in Philadelphia. This is an image of Eastern State Penitentiary. It was a prison that was built to rehabilitate those that were deviant. It was built in about 1829. It was finished in 1829. At that time, it was an extraordinary model of American architectural kind of ingenuity. It had the first let's say, water infrastructure in the city. Very progressive in its time. But it was also a prison, and so in that sense, it marked kind of a division and a distrust in society. When Charles Dickens, the great British writer, comes to Philadelphia in 1824, 1829 or so, he remarks that it's a metaphor for the city. That in a certain sense, the city is also divided. Right? And I would say that today Philadelphia remains that way. And so again, I'm interested in architecture in relationship to that division. So, as a curator, as an educator, I think that we face like three crises in our time. One, a breakdown in trust, a division, as I was just saying before, between different communities, different publics. I think our challenge as educators, as curators, as architects, as citizens, is to construct knowledge exchanges, to rebuild trust between these divided communities. But we also have a distrust today between institutions, particularly in the city that I come from, often a distrust of working together. So again, I think the goal has to be constructing knowledge exchanges between institutions. And then fundamentally, I think the distrust between publics and institutions is the most problematic and really needs to be a priority for all of us. In the last 2 years, instead of focusing on lots of global projects, which I have been doing, I kind of came back to Philadelphia and started to focus on just 10 blocks in the city. It's kind of a complicated 10 blocks because along those 10 blocks, there's so many opportunities for building relationships and trust, but there's also so much historical kind of distrust and division that doing so is incredibly difficult and complicated. So our goal, my goal, but also those I work with, has been to build, in a simplest sense, relationships across race, across ethnicity and class. And it's kind of like if you were to walk this distance, it's 12 minutes. So it's a very quick kind of walk. But at the same time, it's not a quick walk at all, because as one walks those 12 minutes, those 10 blocks, you move from the university that I teach in, an extraordinary university, the first in the United States, founded by Ben Franklin, has an extraordinary concentration of knowledge and of resources for everyone. And my organization that I run is kind of right near the university, on the edge of the university. To a very different landscape. In 2.5 blocks, you start to move into a very different socioeconomic condition. You go from 0% unemployment to 25% unemployment. And as you keep walking, you move into what we call kind of like an inner city. In a way, a landscape that, if anything, marks kind of a collapse of kind of the public sector and civil society. There are no cultural institutions, there are no schools, there's no real grocery stores, and this is the only one in the neighborhood. problems. And so I think that we can continue to think, however we come to this room, we can continue to think individually about building like a building somewhere, or we can think about the relationship of that building to the larger social fabric. And again, how that building can enable all sorts of other relationships. So this, again, would be the challenge that I'm posing to you guys tonight. How can public culture, how can all of the work that we're doing negotiate this distrust and division? So that linear mile, as I call it, that 10 blocks, in fact, it's emblematic of others in the city. We map this with youth and others in our city. We kind of map all these different spaces. It's very uncomfortable for youth and others to walk along. And one could keep drawing this map, the city in a way. Our Philadelphia is a city of these kind of divisions, these tensions. And so in a certain sense, there's a lot of work to be done, and there's a lot of work for young architects and others to kind of take on. This is the front of our space. We organize all sorts of activities. We organize conferences that bring together, for instance, academics and activists. Again, two communities that are often kind of divided. This conference took place at the university, but it also took place at that historic prison. So we use the city as a site for a program. We organize all sorts of activities. This was a project where we hosted all sorts of workshops about what's happening in the neighborhood to the price of housing. And we also built temporary structures with kind of the waste from elsewhere in the city, from the stadium, for instance. The project with an artist from Sarajevo, Braca Dimitrijevic, a project where we used kind of building surfaces as sites of exhibition of kind of anonymous individuals. And then we also host in the world, not just in Philadelphia, all sorts of other activities like that Biennale project. This is a series of conversations with architects and curators of architecture and others around the world to think about other ways to display architecture. As you all know, it's really complicated to display a building. It doesn't really translate well for the public. And so the question of how to think about the exhibition of architecture in other ways is an ongoing conversation, and one that I've been learning a lot from myself. We also talked to others. This is a film we recently made with the mayor in Medellin, Colombia. We're interested in what's happening in Latin America right now with kind of participatory democracy and public architecture. So Teddy Cruz, the architect I mentioned before, who had designed that facade for the U.S. Pavilion, and Sergio Fajardo, this mayor from Medellin, Colombia. In a way, we engage them in a conversation at the border. And so we're always really trying to listen to others and think about our practice differently. I want to talk to you about one project, and then a little bit about the organization, and then I'll stop. So it's called Mixed Place Studio. Because society feels so divided for us, the idea of mixed place studio is quite literally to encourage and facilitate mixture of different groups in the city. In a certain sense, in an architectural kind of framework, what we're trying to do is kind of build upon a vernacular history of architecture in the city, but also radicalize it, make it radically contemporary. We also want to recover, in a certain sense, by using the word vernacular, what I mean is we want to recuperate and recover another model for practice, one that maybe has been forgotten, but that once was vibrant. So this building, it's kind of incredibly small parcel in Philadelphia. It's an important space because it's immediately next to the building where the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution were written. The building dates from 1743, so it's kind of, in a way, a really early building in the history of the United States. And what we're so interested in this building is kind of the role that it played in the civic and cultural life of the city. Although it's so small, it's quite literally kind of like maybe as big as this area right in front of all of you. In a way, it transformed the city in its time. It produced other institutions. It enabled relationships in the city. It enabled the spread of practical knowledge. And it supported other organizations. And these are just some of the things. It was a society that was founded by Benjamin Franklin and others. And then the space was used by all these other organizations in time. So the university that I teach at rented a classroom there. The first museum in America, Philadelphia Museum, began in that space as well, started by a painter. So this one little space incubated so many projects, incubated the civic life of the city. So the question for us is like, where is that happening today? Who is doing that? How can we support that? So the neighborhood that I was just talking about, the neighborhood that linear mile, those 10 blocks crosses through, is a neighborhood that has severe lack of access to institutions, to good schools, extraordinary poverty level, extraordinarily high unemployment. In relationship to that, in response to that, feeling a responsibility for that, what we started to do at my organization was construct a relationship between three institutions. Three institutions that don't really work together, don't understand each other, and have a bit of distrust for each other. A big social services organization that provides for those in need, the University of Pennsylvania, and then my small cultural organization. And in a certain sense, we think of this as an architecture, another form of architecture. A cultural organization working with architects, like Teddy Cruz. A school of design trying to teach a new generation of architecture students, planners, landscape architects, and others. And then a social service organization that's trying to respond to the needs of neighborhoods. And we think of this as quite literally a form of architecture. Maybe not the one that one often is taught, but one that we need to think about, how to create relationships and overcome, again, this distrust and division in our society. So I want to play for you, if I have the time, yeah. I want to play for you what we call a social contract. Basically, the question of how to bridge division is like a very difficult one for us as well. And so what we've been developing is kind of a different model, a model that uses film as a way to kind of express our goals and concerns to one another, but that also it kind of enables us to find some meeting points, some kind of bridge. So I'm going to show you kind of, it's about 6 minutes or so. It's going to take you through all the people that I've been working with in this project called Mixed Play Studio. We were each filmed separately, so we didn't hear what each other was saying. And then this was edited down into a common kind of document, which functions in a legal manner almost for us. It holds us accountable to each other. And we feel that we have to be accountable to each other to basically to enable that sense of trust to develop. So it'll give you a sense of the project, the different people involved, then I'll talk to you a bit more about that project.
Mixed Place is an alternative educational model that responds to the current void in arts education and the crisis in community participation and political representation. So our challenge is how to frame a new conversation that responds to these questions. How can we find a common language across divided constituencies? How do we enable spaces and tools that can facilitate the construction of this common language? Can we amplify, in fact, the community's voices, their histories, their everyday practices, their creative intelligence? Can they be part of the debate in the construction of a new civic imagination? So as we begin this project, this conversation, and the construction of that common language, we begin a circulation of knowledge exchanges.
The problem in our youth today is that we're so accustomed to hearing we want to hear, and we're so afraid to hear the need to hear. And I think this program will put us down us in life. I think this place should be another space to come to get an education outside of school. Deal with topics that maybe schools won't cover. They've taken a lot of topics I think we need out of schools. Like we don't talk about jobs, social relations. We don't talk about the pressures that are in this world and how we can overcome them.
One of the outcomes I'd love to see is development of a language that everyone feels very comfortable with. And then that could be something that's ongoing, that can be a tool that they can use to talk about community, to talk about the city and their own involved process in kind of maximizing themselves as part of the community and their city. and even around culture and the art, so that there's kind of commonality of language, so we can kind of go forward from there, you know, and it can translate into something else. It can translate into whatever they think are the takeaways or the next steps, that they have this language now to be able to communicate that amongst ourselves, and then also as they're broadening out a little bit further.
And it serves as Mixed Place has very practical outcomes at its core. There will be a curriculum. That curriculum will be the basis for an urban kind of pedagogy, a classroom in which youth will co-produce with others knowledge about the neighborhood they live in which youth will be encouraged to, in very direct and immediate ways, see themselves as advocates for the civic, for the city, for their neighborhood. I think there's also something more immaterial, something more philosophical at stake. And I think that it concerns a different way of thinking about how one belongs to others, how one basically inhabits a city, how one inhabits a neighborhood, how one has responsibilities to that city and that neighborhood. And I think that's maybe something that is more abstract. It may be hard to put one's fingers around it, but I think that's also one of the outcomes that Mixed Place is trying to perform. Could we imagine a different way of belonging and a different way of cohabiting space, cohabiting the city, a city which is defined by borders?
We primarily at this time need to engage in the designing of new collaborations, creative interfaces, not only with the public itself, but with the different agencies that maintain themselves a bit divided. You know, I think that traditionally, unfortunately, we continue to perpetuate these sort of archipelago of silos of knowledge, and I think that at the base, at its very base, Mixed Place can potentially be a very interesting model of collaboration.
I was interested in demonstrating how the mapping that I do is relevant and how it could help hold up Philadelphia and its stories and help to point out some of the challenges that we have. The survey that Du Bois did of the 740, he interviewed door-to-door at black households in 1896. He went up and down the street in downtown Philadelphia and interviewed people and made a map and produced a whole book about that. And I wanted to recreate that to the best that I could. And I just started to have, one summer at a time, undergraduates from Harvard for college, from Penn, involved in this. But I feel like Mixed Place is an opportunity for me to bring students from the School of Design, to bring graduate students who want to connect what they're doing in the classroom, with mentors in a real community.
I think not only for the conversation and the dialogue to happen, but for the space to be created for that dialogue to happen, I think is huge, would be a great outcome of this project. Just creating that place and then really literally if it could become a replicable project so that you're touching other youth with it.
So, as a group, we began by superimposing the map of the city on our front gallery, on our front exhibition space. Then, with Teddy Cruz kind of facilitating, that architect facilitating this process, we kind of cut out a shape of a table. Kind of traced on that table the path of the river as it cuts through the city of Philadelphia. And then we further segmented the table. The result was an urban table that could enable both conversation, kind of individually, teamwork in a way, but also that could enable a common conversation. So here, maybe it's more evident here. On the one hand, a common conversation, a common table. On the other hand, individual workstations, team-based activities. So that was kind of, in a way, the way that we also began the project. Not just through that social contract, but that social contract followed by a process of designing and building together. So you saw in the video, this kind of collective construction of this 26-foot map of the city of Philadelphia that now we use as a sort of planning tool to generate all kinds of projects. Then we went on as a group together with the youth, not treating the youth as kind of objects to teach, but rather as individuals to engage and to work together with, to partner with. We developed a curriculum together. So in Philadelphia right now, it's a complicated moment. There's been no arts education in the schools for 10 years. And then last month, 30 schools were basically closed. So a lot of the public school system is struggling. A lot of the youth are kind of being shifted to different schools every year. They're not getting the education that they want. And so the idea is together, as you heard in the video, to construct a space for after school, outside of school, that can compensate for what school isn't providing them, as Dwayne had said. It's a three-part, three-phase kind of program. During the summer, all sorts of, the curriculum and the activities are all structured around the social services organization and the knowledge that they have to share. In the fall, graduate students, design students like yourselves, like many of you from the university, become involved, pair up with the youth, and together they work to further the projects that the youth began during the summer. And then in the spring, this all leads to kind of exhibitions and other activities in the community. So we've been thinking about how we could design that curriculum, not just, again, how we could design buildings or even the relationship, but quite literally how we could design every element. So we began with 10 youth. The 10 youth self-select into groups of 2, 5 teams. And then that team of 2 basically chooses the neighborhood issues that they want to tackle, the tools they want to learn and use to develop their projects. Now, all of this work that we're doing is, in a certain sense, invisible from kind of a conventional perspective in Philadelphia, but also in the United States. So I want to propose like a different way to evaluate what is of value in a community, and also, by extension, in, let's say, in architecture as a community as well. So in Philadelphia, there's great prosperity and there's great work that's being done across all institutions, across civil society. But we're a really small institution. The project, in a way, that we undertook, Mixed Place, that I've just been talking about, our budget was $26,000, and that is basically about a third of our total funds for the year. So basically, we don't really have enough money to pay anybody a salary. And so what we're trying to do is, in a way, develop a different model, but one that can still be incredibly effective, even in the absence of kind of traditional resource. So we measure our footprint, we measure kind of our impact, not in terms of kind of the money that we attract or that we spend, but rather, again, in the relationships and the trust that we construct. And if we do that, in fact, another map of the city emerges, not a map like the one that I showed you before, that is of kind of individual institutions in isolation, but rather kind of a network of relations between different institutions and communities throughout the city. And I think this is the model, again, that we should be trying to design and choreograph and build. So in a certain sense, our lack of access to traditional resources, our lack of access to funding, in a major sense, on a large scale, has been really creative for us. That conflict, that lack of access to financial resources, has generated other economies and other creative kind of maneuvers and responses. In Philadelphia, of course, our activities led to other activities. But over the years, they've also led to activities in other cities. And that, again, represents an architecture of collaboration. And then those activities in Philadelphia and the United States has led to other relationships. Relations with the First School of Architecture, for instance, in Rwanda that we've been working a lot with cultural communities, architectural communities in China, with all sorts of projects, a whole series of projects that have been going on now for 6 years with the architectural community in Lahore, in Pakistan. So our small kind of economy has nevertheless enabled all sorts of collaborations and relationships. And I want to propose to you, in a certain sense, that kind of model, a model, again, of collaboration, not of kind of isolation. So we started out, I was 24, I didn't really know what I was doing. I had been part of another organization in Philadelphia that I helped start for literature and poetry. But I was 24 and I was like, what do I do next? And so Slought kind of emerged from that question about what to do next. Over the years, what I understand to be my goals and my priorities has changed a lot. So maybe in the beginning I was focused on Philadelphia, but over the life of the organization, working together with others, my relationship to the world has changed. My relationship to what one can do with the internet has changed. And in a certain sense, I want to say that the organization is the intersection. You know, it's that intersection between Philadelphia and the world and the internet. And I think, of course, one could say the same thing here in Pristina. The intersection between Pristina, the larger kind of context here in Kosovo, in the region, but also in the world, and how the internet enables kind of the bridging of divisions and borders as well. I think this is something that we can all think about our practices in relationship to. So in a certain sense, this small organization that I direct is kind of perpetually in flux. Not only is the relationship between Philadelphia and the world and the internet always changing, but so too kind of the organization itself. And I want to suggest that particularly like what I saw in Bosnia and in Serbia were kind of civil society institutions that were totally frozen in time. I know there's a word that you guys often use, like kind of not responding to kind of what's happening in society, kind of fixed and immobile. And so I want to propose kind of a model that in a way is a bit more agile and constantly shifting and responsive and responding to civil society and what it needs at any one moment. So not kind of an organization that's fixed, but an organization that's in flux. So I'm just going to end in a way with just kind of one other comment about values. One of the things that's worked really well for us in Philadelphia as a small organization is to define like what we stand for and to be accountable to the communities that we work with by being very transparent about what our priorities are. We began in a way with two values: a commitment to the public, whether theoretically or in terms of public space in the city, and dialogue, the importance of thinking and talking with others. That led, out of that emerged an interest in and a concern about how to display culture and architecture, how to reflect on the process by which we produce architecture and culture more generally, the value of partnerships, the need to resist and respond to the urgencies of one society, and one of my favorites, exception. Exception being that we should always be changing and thinking differently about what we're doing, that we shouldn't repeat ourselves. That just because we've kind of maybe succeeded in one respect, that doesn't mean we should make a pattern out of it. We should always be taking risks. We should always be valuing kind of curiosity, let's say. We should welcome curiosity as a method rather than to discourage it. We should, again, always be touching on what we're doing and change perpetually in the process in relation to what's happening in society, so as to produce another institutional model. So these are just some of the projects that we've taken on, some of which I was talking to you about, but they all in a way perform different values and redefine those values. And so I kind of want to suggest, again, just to kind of think not just about how you can define as architects kind of an architectural practice that consists of constructing a structure, but how you could construct a series of social relationships and how an organization could itself be thought of as another form of architecture. So I'm going to stop there. I don't know how much time we have. It's about 10 minutes. So if any of you have any questions, I'd love to engage them. On the question.
Just wanted to know, the project was dealing with the university and your organization and the social organization. Who was in charge of the project and as to the implementation? As a curriculum that you are working, will be a part of or you're doing it within that project, or you're going to be part of the university, upper stage.
In some
And does the government or the governmental issues are part of that process? Since many of the implementation projects within the city space, the decision-making is still in the governmental level.
So our projects play out in two different ways. Sometimes we work from the top down, right? We have a relationship with somebody in a position of prominence, resource, power, and from the top of the institution, of course, a collaboration is undertaken. But more generally, our projects begin from the bottom up. We don't necessarily have the full support of the institution, but we start to work with individuals within that institution who both believe in that institution and believe in the need for that institution to change. And of course, in a small organization, the organization is always changing. But in a large institution, it's not so easy for an institution to change. Right? There are logical reasons, whether we like them or not, for these institutions to maintain the kind of the form that they have. So in the case, for instance, of Mixed Place, we've been working with some of the students and the faculty. Right? And working with the students and the faculty meant that we also started to work with the school more generally, the dean, and all sorts of other opportunities started to emerge. The curriculum is meant to be a functioning of a curriculum. We haven't had, this past year, we haven't had support for the architecture students. They didn't get any money, they didn't get a relief from their courses. They weren't supported actively. And now what we're trying to work on next is for the school to support the students in that work. And so it's kind of an ongoing process. I don't think the curriculum will ever be finished, but I think that each year it'll adapt and change in relationship to what is needed. So it's kind of like a living document in a way. But yes, one that is supposed to not just be like charity for youth or for neighborhoods. It's supposed to also transform the institution itself. So I guess maybe that's a better way to answer the question. What we're trying to propose when all of us in that video talk about knowledge exchange, we're not trying to propose that the institution share its knowledge and change the neighborhood. Rather that also the institution be changed by the neighborhood. And then what is defined as architectural knowledge also be kind of expanded and made more open and egalitarian and democratic. And so we're often working with the youth, but also with the architecture students to really try to apply the readings that they've been studying, but to apply them, but also then to critique them and to try to kind of produce another body of architectural knowledge that maybe doesn't come from the typical journals and publications, or even from kind of the commercial kind of field of architecture more generally, but that is equally powerful and maybe even more meaningful and transformative.